From B Media Production, this is B Podcasting. Engage your audience with podcasts.
Hi and welcome to episode 14. I'm Nick Schildberger. This episode's a little different from previous ones. We're going to chat about OzPod2017, the second podcast conference hosted by the ABC. I unfortunately couldn't attend, but my co-host and podcast aficionado, Chris Ashmore, was there. Hi, Chris.
G'day, Nick. Wow, what an event. I don't know how many were there, maybe 200 or 300 in the crowd. It was sold out, 34 speakers, as I mentioned last episode. Now, it's obvious, I think, compared to last year's event, Australia is becoming a lot more sophisticated, a lot more professional, and there's a lot more money invested in podcasting. But outside of the ABC, when it comes to the production of content, well, I think with a few exceptions, I think we still have a long way to go to match what they're doing in the United States. So this episode, yes, you're going to have to listen to me talk. Apologies. But I won't go through it line by line. It was a 7-hour event, but here are some of the highlights. And we'll start with the ABC Director of Radio, Michael Mason, at the beginning of the program with his big announcement.
So it gives me great pleasure today, on behalf of Michelle Guthrie and the broader ABC leadership team, to announce the celebration of podcasting, the launch of a $1 million ABC podcasting fund.
Now, that money is not for the ABC. It's not for the big players either. This is money that's going to go to independent podcasters. They're commissioning independents who have got good ideas in the communities around Australia.
That under the umbrella of the ABC, though. So they've got the money to allocate it to other podcasters. Is that how it's going to work?
I think so. And so they will, they will mentor, they will bring those podcasts on air, whether it's actually on the radio or on their ABC Listen app or whatever. They're going to dish out this money for them. So it is good.
Well, I'm sure there are a lot of people in the audience there that would have been quite excited if they understood that they could get their hands on some of that money.
I think more than half the audience. Now, before he said that, though, he also said this.
I know producers and broadcasters from Europe and North America continually look to us for talent, great ideas and inspiration in the field. And that's something we really should celebrate.
Really, though? I mean, is other than science versus, I'm thinking, what does he mean? Those overseas looking at us for inspiration or for, talent. I still see, even today, that we're still looking at the United States for inspiration and it'll come up a bit later how we, as Australians, are predominantly listening to American stuff. So, the ABC is different, though, and I'm sure he's probably talking more about the ABC.
Well, if it wasn't for the ABC, I don't think podcasting in Australia would be anywhere near where it is now.
That's right, exactly. I mean, it's slowly generating towards something bigger, but without the ABC's involvement, the professionalism probably isn't getting as close as it is now. Now, one of the early speakers was a speaker from last year, James Cridland, radio futurologist, who we had on the program on episode 1 on the back of his excellent presentation last year. So,
I think that episode's actually the most downloaded episode of this series. So people are obviously going back to listen to James.
He's a good speaker. I mean, he's probably regurgitating a lot of the statistics, but it's his spin on it and what he thinks about it. Now, I won't go through all the stats that he went through, but a lot of the stats that he does have come from the ABC's recent survey, which actually came out the same week. And it's important to note, because I don't think it was articulated on the day, or it hasn't been articulated so much in the press, the respondents to the ABC's survey were members, including myself, of ABC's Your Space. And for everybody who attended the OzPod conference were invited to participate in the survey, but first you had to sign up to the Your Space account that the ABC's got. They also put an external link to the survey, which was shared on the Facebook accounts of Triple J, ABC Local Radio and ABC Grandstand. And the reason I'm saying this is that it's not representative of Australians. It's representative of those who follow the ABC closely. These are people that are engaged with the ABC. And if you're engaged with the ABC, then of course you know about podcasting, because they promote it so much that you can't not be aware of podcasting.
But despite all of that, James also has stats from the US, the Edison research, some stats from the UK. And interestingly, those stats are quite similar to the ABC ones. So it seems podcasting is sort of, I guess, filtering through.
You're right. They are very closely related, the results of them. But you need to be aware that it isn't representative of the whole country.
So do you want to get to some numbers?
Yes. One thing that stood out, there's been a 56% increase in podcast listening from 2016. And I think from our point of view, it's obvious that people are knowing more about podcasting. But still a long way to go. And one thing that's holding the industry back, as James says, is the lack of awareness.
I hear podcasting mentioned an awful lot on RM, but I have to say, if you listen to ABC Radio Brisbane or 4BC, occasionally somebody has to, I would challenge you to hear podcasting being mentioned maybe quite as much as it could be. So I think that the mass media could do more, and that would benefit the entire sector.
Absolutely. When the mainstream media is quoting from podcasts or using that in their bulletins or magazine-style TV shows, then it's becoming more mainstream. Now, after that, James moves on to talk about what kinds of podcasts Aussies are subscribing to, and here he references Pocket Cast. Now, Pocket Cast is a fantastic Aussie podcast app with hundreds of thousands of podcasts on it. And James mentions that one of the slides quotes Australians' top 10 podcast subscriptions in Pocket Casts. The top 10 are all American. There's not one Australian in the top 10, which is interesting. But that perhaps illustrates my point earlier. As consumers, we're still looking at the US for our podcast listening. And because they came in earlier, we continue to look at them. I've still got Serial as a subscription.
Well, Serial was number one on that list, and Serial was produced how long ago? 2, 3 years?
Well, yeah, the first one 2014, and then the second one, when was that, 2016? So it's still there. People probably are creatures of habit, so they don't bother to take it off, perhaps. But another thing James brought up, which he brought up last year, and it's that damn chart on iTunes. So here he's talking about the top 10 podcasts on iTunes as of Wednesday, a couple of days before the conference. Just listen to this.
Some really good Australian content in here. Richard Feidler at number 5. Congratulations, Richard Feidler. The number 1, when I looked, was Unspeakable. Now, that has one episode. It's from the Victoria Police. It has one episode. I'm sure it's a brilliant podcast, right? I genuinely am. I'm sounding sarcastic now. No, I am sure it's a great podcast, but I'm also sure, very sure, that it isn't as popular as Conversations. So I think we should just bear in mind that the iTunes chart is not a chart. It's just an indicator of new subscribers. What Apple have done here is they've built this chart to reflect trends and to surface new and interesting podcasts. And that's brilliant. And it's a real achievement to get into the iTunes chart. But the iTunes chart is not a chart of total downloads or subscriptions or anything else, just so that we know.
Indeed, it's not a chart, and it's curated, and we'll talk about that a bit later.
I know you have strong opinions on the way Apple curate that chart.
Well, strong opinions about people should know this sort of stuff. I don't really care, but we'll go into that a bit later. One other thing James said, I won't play the quote, but basically Edison Research and Triton Survey, who asked participants when they listen to a podcast, how do they listen to it? Do they download it to listen to later? Do they subscribe to the podcast, or do they just listen to it immediately? And 62% responded that they listened to it immediately, which is very interesting because he quoted Omni Studio said that 31% listen to podcasts directly from the Omni play button embedded on a website. So he's basically saying that we should think about how people listen to it. It's not necessarily in a podcast, but it's on a website. So for companies out there that are doing podcasting, ensure that you've got your play button on your website.
Yeah, I think all podcasters want subscribers because you assume once people subscribe that they're going to listen. Although, having said that earlier stat that says Serial's still number 1, I think highlights that people, when they subscribe, they don't unsubscribe, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're listening. But that's a whole different topic. Yes. But on that embedding of a player and the fact that 62% are listening immediately, I think that also highlights that people are seeking out content on a particular topic. And when they find it, they go, oh, there's a podcast on that topic. They want to listen right away. And we put a lot of our efforts into, make sure you have the subscribe button and click the subscribe button. But if you just want to listen right now, have the play button there, as you said.
That's right, exactly. So the keynote speaker at OzPod2017 was Jen White, a host at Chicago-based public radio station WBEZ. In 2016, she was the host and creator of the brilliant and highly successful Making Oprah podcast for WBEZ. Now, you've listened to this, Nick.
I did. I listened to her keynote, and it comes as no surprise that Jen is an excellent storyteller, and I really enjoyed listening to her keynote, even though it was online without getting to see her. And I've pulled out a couple of quotes that we'll play now for our listeners, the ones I think that are most relevant to our audience. In this first one, she's highlighting the fact that to do a high-quality podcast, you need resources and efforts behind it. You can't just do it as a hobby or on a whim. But let's listen to how her Oprah podcast came about.
First of all, WBEZ, the station I work at, it's an NPR station located in Chicago. Leadership there realized that while we were doing well as a terrestrial radio station, there was this whole space in podcasting that we weren't taking advantage of. We had a lot of podcasts that were out there, but they were really just passion projects people were working on their own time. There wasn't institutional support to make great podcasts. And what they realized was that in order to do that, they had to invest in talent.
So she goes on to explain that they hired her, obviously, and then a couple of podcast producers and then an executive producer. So they had a whole team who could dedicate time to producing a great podcast that would have significant reach. And I think the point here is that for businesses that want to do great podcasting, you do need to invest and probably have a team, either outsource it to a company like us or bring people in to do it. It's not something that you can just do casually as a hobby. Another question that comes up way too often, and we've talked about it a few times, is how long should a podcast be? Jen has an answer for that.
People are always asking, what's the right length? The length of your podcast is driven by the content you're producing. That's the best answer I have for you.
That's the best answer anybody has.
It's the perfect answer.
Well done. I don't think we have to say any more than that.
Nothing more. The next one was... Jen talks about a lot of mantras that came out of the interviews. When I say mantras, they were Oprah's mantras from producing her successful TV show. And there's one here about running your own race, which I think is really important in the podcasting space.
Run your own race. How does that matter in podcasting? Everyone wants to duplicate success. So Serial comes out, and everybody's like, oh, look at what Serial did. True crime. People are listening to true crime. And then you see this bubbling up of true crime podcasts, some very good, some not so much. When we started to build the Making Oprah podcast, what we first started with was, what are we good at? What do we do really well as an organization? We tell Chicago stories really well, and we know how to guide people in telling their own stories. So how do we build from what we do as an organization and transition it into this space?
Can I say something? She's absolutely right. Do what you are passionate about and you know about. But can I just say that my notes at OzPod when she said that were nostalgia. She's interviewing Oprah Winfrey, and you think back at Richard Simmons earlier this year. People love to hear about those that used to be in the public gaze. And this is why I think it's so successful, is because people want to hear more about where is she now, that kind of thing. But she's kind of right with what she's saying.
And I guess for me, it was more about, we're talking to businesses who want to produce podcasts. It's about, stick to your knitting, play to your strengths. I mean, we talked about creating podcasts that are a brand in their own right and they become a valuable asset in your content marketing. But don't get too creative and too tricky. Stick to what you know, and those messages will then enhance your business in the marketplace rather than trying to go off and replicate something that somebody else is doing.
That's right. Now, there was another panel 2, at OzPod2017 was titled Who Will Deliver Us?, hosted by Rob Lowenthal of Whooshka. There was Nick Qua on the big screen behind everyone. It was kind of a bit strange, but Adam Martin of Acasts, Sharon Taylor of Omni Studio, and Russell Ivanovic of Pocket Casts. Now, a lot of the talk earlier on was on curation, how these, I suppose, podcasting platforms decide on what is, on the front page of their apps, so to speak. Russell spoke of what they decide what gets onto their front page of Pocket Casts. Now, there was a question and answer session. Nick, I don't know if you listened to that live or later on. But,
I did.
There was a bit of a gap in the presentation when Rob asked for questions. No one put their hand up, so I thought, well, I'll do it. I'll put my hand up. Asked a question, so 300 sets of eyes looking at me. So I may not have asked the question as grammatically correct or as I wanted. But anyway, have a listen to it because I want to talk to you about what the responses were. Chris Ashmore, B Media Production. Question about Apple's podcast chart, or not a chart, as James would say. I think the industry's worst kept secret. There's a bloke called Steve in the United States who decides what is new and noteworthy on the chart. Just wonder your thoughts about it, and perhaps everybody's thoughts, how comfortable we are with someone who can influence the way we listen to podcasts. One bloke in the US who decides what's on new and noteworthy. Or maybe I'm being melodramatic.
That's a really good question. We talk about this really open system, and there's a fellow in the US who basically controls the fate of whether or not you get 5,000 or 10,000 downloads. But it's quite an open environment now. And
it's the same as reading a magazine. A magazine has an editor, and the content within it is curated. It doesn't devalue it in any way. It just short circuits the information you're getting. And actually, in the world in which we live with kind of infinite choice, I think it's quite nice when somebody's taking some of that choice away. Steve is no longer Steve, I believe, at Apple, so that's kind of one thing. But new and noteworthy, it should always be a curated magazine-style approach to it, and that's separate from the charts. And when you're having a conversation with Apple about getting your show featured in new and noteworthy, they're using companies like Whooshka, like Acast, like Omni, and others in Pocket Cast as a bit of a shit filter, really. They're coming to you because they trust your input and value on the market. And if you abuse that relationship and start pushing shows that nobody wants or overtly kind of branded content, then you're going to erode that relationship. So I think there's always going to be a need for a human curation, back to our kind of curation point. And I think Steve, or whoever he is now, holds a very important position, and that's not going to change, I don't think, in the short term.
What a good question, Chris.
Oh, thanks, Dave.
So one person at Apple, and we have talked about that in an earlier episode with Sharon Taylor from Omni, but it sounds like from the response that the big players, the platforms, they've got the ability to talk to this one person at Apple. So there's a small group of people driving the conversation about what should be new and noteworthy on the Apple website. Is that right?
Well, yeah, it is a bullshit filter, and I agree with Adam when he says that. Someone has to decide what goes on new and noteworthy. The point is nobody, well, you do now, but not many people know about it. And that's the thing. You've got Mumbrella or the ABC or Whooshka who have access to the bat phone in the bat cave to the new Steve at Apple. And, of course, with so many podcasts that person has to filter to see what is worthy to go on, they don't have the time to do that. So, yeah, they're going to listen to players like this that have access to quality podcasts. But we should all know about it. And that was the point. And are we comfortable with somebody in the US who may have unconscious biases or have a political point of view that's allowing particular podcasts to be listened to across the other side of the world in Australia? There's a lot of power there. Anyway, maybe I am being melodramatic.
I think it's great that we're trying to, pass this information on, but at the end of the day, does it actually make that big a difference? Because later on that same panel discussion, I heard them talk about a podcaster who got an extra 5% downloads because of being
James Cridland he's written an article on this. There was a well-known podcaster in the United States who got his podcast onto iTunes, either the top 10 or the front page or something, and the spike was roughly 5%. It wasn't a lot. 5% is good.
Better than a poke in the eye, but I think that panel went on to say that don't rely on the charts to get distribution of your podcast. You need to be doing your own marketing, your own promotion, and there are much more successful ways to get into the many millions of downloads than relying on being on the chart or in the new and noteworthy in Apple Podcasts. And the final presentation that I want to quickly refer to is the one by Rachel Corbett earlier in the day. She's got the You've Got to Start Somewhere podcast. And she made a good point about the tone of your podcast and thinking about your audio brand.
The other thing that's important to think about is the sound and getting the right sound for your brand. This is something your intro and your outro and the music around your show is like your version of McDonald's Golden Arches. That's your audio brand. McDonald's isn't going to get a logo and then change it, and you don't want to either if you can help it. It's really important that it sets a good tone for your show, and also that it gives a familiarity to your listeners, because it'll make them feel something when they listen to your show, and they will get attached to it. You'll be surprised. You might think it's just a bit of music that leads into your content, but it really is a great way to make your show sound professional. Just that simple intro and outro can make the difference between sounding like something you've just thrown the mics on and a proper show.
We've talked about audio strategies in recent episodes, and now the phrase audio brand comes up. I think these are phrases that marketing departments are probably not overly familiar with at the moment, but I think Rachel makes a good point that it is really important that you think about all these things when you embark on a podcast, like you would with anything else in your marketing. It all ties back to the tone of your business, the tone of your marketing. So the colours in your logo and getting your logo done when you start your business is something you spend hours and hours and hours and thousands of dollars on. You should do the same with a podcast to make sure that it's all linking back to that same feel.
If you're a premium company providing a premium service or product, why would you use something with rubbish sound design or music that just doesn't fit the tone of your company? So that's what she makes there. And so many companies that are throwing up rubbish videos on their website or audio because they don't understand it. Well, you got to understand it, because from now on, people can understand the differences between good quality and poor quality.
Yeah, and we're all for businesses getting into this podcasting space, but you can damage your brand if you don't do it properly.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's it, Chris, for episode 14 of Be Podcasting. If you want to listen to more from OzPod, there was about 7 hours of content. You can do so on the ABC website, and we'll make sure we have a link in the show notes. So that you don't miss out on future episodes of Be Podcasting, you can subscribe in Apple Podcasts or where you get your podcasts. And if you found this valuable, we'd really appreciate you leaving a review. For more about us, you can go to be.com.au or Twitter @BEMediaProd, or drop us a line at info@be.com.au. We'd love to hear from you and answer any questions you have about the world of podcasting. We've been helping brands of all sizes create audio to communicate their message for more than 3 decades, and we'd love to discuss working with you. From all of us at Be Media Production, thanks so much for listening.
Be Podcasting is produced by the team at Be Media Production. Managing Director Nick Schildberger, Executive Producer Heather Dawson, Producer Chris Ashmore, and I'm Peter Letts, Director of Audio. For more about us, go to be.com.au.